using the OM1 for birds in flight at Bempton Cliffs. So in this video I'm going to be talking about using the OM1 for birds in flight, and I'll be showing examples of pictures that I've taken using the autofocus for flight photography. Living in Colchester, I don't honestly get the chance very much for doing birds in flight. I've had the OM1 for about 2.5 months now and used it quite extensively. I've used it for photographing birds from hides. I've used it for doing macro stuff, damselflies, butterflies, that sort of thing. But I haven't really had much opportunity to test it out fully for birds in flight. Initially when I got it, I went down to Elmley Marshes Reserve and I actually photographed lapwing and short-eared owls in flight, but apart from that I haven't really had much opportunity. But about 3 weeks ago I went away with a group of photographic friends to Bempton Cliffs up on the Yorkshire Coast, and we had 3 days up there. It gave me the opportunity to actually photograph on the cliffs, but also we took a boat out onto the sea to actually photograph diving gannets, and we actually were lucky enough to get conditions for 3 mornings running where we could actually get out on the boat. So what I'm going to be doing is showing you images, talking about how I feel about the autofocus for the OM1, and images from 3 different lenses. I was using the 300mm f4, sometimes with the 1.4 converter, and this was ideal from up on the cliffs. But going out on the boat I was using the 100 to 400mm zoom. I don't actually have that lens, I borrowed it from a friend. And it was actually very good lens. It's pretty sharp, and it was, it was great for being on a boat where you can't actually change the distance that you're actually photographing from. And I also used the 12 to 40mm 2.8 wide angle zoom. Now that sounds ridiculous, using a wide angle zoom for birds in flight. But particularly when they're doing the Gannets and the Chumming session, the birds are very close to the boat indeed. So I'll be talking about the autofocus, how I've changed the settings slightly from when I initially had it, and my thoughts on it, and showing images from that trip. So I hope you enjoyed the pictures. So first of all, I'm going to show some of the images of gannets, fulmars, puffins and other seabirds that can be photographed from up on the cliffs. Because the birds are some distance away, a long telephoto is needed, so I was using the OM1 with the 300mm f4, sometimes as a straight 300mm and other times in conjunction with the MC14 converter. As gannets are quite large birds, these can be photographed with the straight 300mm lens, but for smaller birds like puffins, guillemots and razorbills, the MC14 converter gave me a better chance of filling the frame. The settings I used on the OM1 for photographing birds in flight were bird tracking selected in the menu, SH2 on the drive menu and set at 50 frames per second. Having been experimenting with the settings for birds in flight on the OM1, I find that when trying to track a bird in flight, I now use continue autofocus rather than continue autofocus plus tracking. I have found that continue autofocus plus tracking works well when working from a hide, where you're using a setup where you know where the bird is likely to be. But for trying to follow focus a bird in flight, continue autofocus gives me the best results. I still have bird tracking selected in the menu. Once the OM1 locks onto a bird in flight, it will stay in focus for most of the burst. It's not 100% perfect, but I have found that I'm getting a lot more keepers using the OM1 than on my previous EM1X and EM1 Mark III. That's not to say that the autofocus on these models was bad, it's just that the autofocus on the OM1 is in a different league. Photographing birds in flight when there is a strong wind is a lot easier than when there is very little wind. Often birds will fly into wind, and when they do this they are often flying a lot slower. Early in the morning it was fairly calm with very little wind, but by the afternoon the wind had got up, and as these gannets flew into the wind it made shots like this relatively easy. Whilst on the cliffs, I also took some static shots of birds, as well as shots of birds as they flew from the cliffs. Static portraits like these are quite easy, but often it is better to wait for the birds to do something rather than sitting there and photographing as straight portraits. You just have to look for some activity or interaction before pressing the shutter button. In these two images you can see there is a dispute where one bird is getting into the other bird's space. Because the ledges on the cliffs are quite narrow, you will see that a lot of the birds on the cliffs are facing inwards. To get a shot of a bird as it flies from the cliff, look for a bird facing towards the sea. When you see a bird facing outwards, there is a good chance it's getting ready to fly, and then you have the chance of getting a good action shot. If you're very observant, a bird will sometimes tense up slightly as it's getting ready to fly. I say they do this sometimes, but by no means always. Often, by the time it flies and you press the shutter button, the chances are you'll have a picture with part of the bird going out the side of the frame, or even no bird in the picture at all. This is where Pro Capture is such a big advantage. For people who do not know what Pro Capture is, it's a way of taking pictures before you have fully pressed the shutter button. It's almost like a time machine that allows you to travel back in time, so you do not miss action sequences that would be otherwise very difficult to capture. With this shot of a puffin, I wanted to catch it in flight as it flew from the ledge. It's important when framing the composition of the image that you leave enough space for the bird to fly into. So I locked the focus onto the puffin and waited for it to fly. I was using Pro Capture SH2, which would allow me to shoot continuous autofocus at 50 frames a second. The advantage of Pro Cap is that it allowed me to get this shot as the second puffin flew onto the ledge. This happened in the briefest part of a second, and I had no warning that it was going to happen. Because I had Pro Capture running, as I saw it fly in, I fully pressed the shutter button, and I had 25 frames that were being recorded before fully depressing the shutter. So now I'm going to show some shots taken on the boat trip. Because you never know if conditions are going to be suitable for the boat to sail, we booked the boat for 3 mornings running, in the hope of getting at least 1 or 2 mornings when we could get out. There were 7 of us, so we had plenty of space on the boat without getting in each other's way. It takes about an hour for the boat to reach the area where the chumming takes place, but you do get lots of opportunities to take shots of birds as the boat is going out, as well as when it's coming back. For these in-flight shots, I decided that a zoom would be a better option than a fixed focal length lens, so I used an Olympus 100-400 f5 to 6.3 lens that I'd borrowed from a friend. Although this is not a pro lens like the 300mm f4, it did give me the flexibility of being able to reframe images by zooming. Although I tended to concentrate on individual shots of the birds, particularly when they were taking off from the water, I did try some shots of groups of birds as they flew in. There was certainly plenty of opportunities for flight shots from the boat, and once the focus had locked onto the bird, it stayed with it for most of the frames. I say once the autofocus locked onto the bird. Picking up a bird in the viewfinder with a long telephoto lens can be difficult with a fast-moving subject, whichever camera system you're using. In the focusing target mode, I selected a large grid rather than all points selected. Although I have used all points selected previously when working from a hide, in this situation, where you can have more than one bird in the frame, the large grid worked the best. I could then ensure that the focusing locked onto the bird that I was selecting. During the trip there were plenty of opportunities for shots of razorbills, guillemots and puffins as they took off from the water. Once we reached the area where the chumming would take place, the boatman throws in fish and the activity of the gannets diving is really quite exciting. Because the birds know they're going to get free offerings, the gannets mass around the boat as soon as the first fish is thrown into the water, and the action starts with the gannets diving and fighting. The chumming takes about 8 to 10 minutes, and you need to have fast reactions to capture the action as they dive. Make sure you have a new SD card in your camera and that you have a fully charged battery. For this, a long lens is not necessary, and most of the time I was using the OM1 at the 12 to 40mm f2.8. Occasionally I would use the 40 to 150 2.8. I wanted to get shots of gannets diving into the water. When you consider that a gannet can hit the water at 60 miles per hour, you need very fast reaction. I tried to do this using SH2, but my reactions were just not fast enough, and when reviewing the images after a bird had dived, I invariably found I had missed it. So I then set the OM1 to Pro Cap SH2, and I achieved the gannet diving every time. During the chumming, we took a number of shots whilst leaning over the side of the boat and composing using the flip-out articulated screen. This was really useful and enabled me to get the camera lower down to nearer the water level. This meant that we could get images with a low viewpoint and enabled us to include the cliffs in the background. I used a Peak Design wrist strap so that even if the camera slipped out of my hand, it would get wet but it would not end at the bottom of the sea. I did try shooting video using this method, but it was very difficult trying to handhold video and keep the horizon level, particularly with the boat rocking about as much as it was. After the chumming session finished, the gannets tend to drift away, but some of the other birds will hang around. These fulmars came closer to the boat, so I changed the lens back to the 100 to 400 and managed to get some nice portraits, as well as this shot with some interaction. So this was the first real opportunity I had to seriously try out the OM1 for flight photography. I did not achieve anywhere near 100% of the shots sharp, but I certainly achieved a very high percentage of keepers. I suppose one disadvantage of shooting SH2 50 frames a second is it does mean you get a lot of images to sort through, and sometimes you have to be quite aggressive in which shots to save and which to delete. When you have a series of shots in a burst that are all sharp, you just have to save the images which have the best framing and wing position. 50 frames per second does allow you to achieve shots where you get the perfect wing position, so I think it's worth shooting at this burst rate. I hope you enjoyed the video and the images. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you will be notified of future uploads. Thanks for watching.